fire captain, engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Before there were streaming wars, before Marvel dominated every screen, before the internet turned every fandom into a global army, there was one TV show that dared to imagine a future where humanity had reached for the stars. It premiered on September 8, 1966. The ratings were unimpressive. The budget was embarrassingly low. And yet, Star Trek, the original series, became one of the most influential pieces of science fiction ever made. But behind the transporter beams and the Vulcan salutes lies a story nobody talks about. These are 20 weird facts about Star Trek, 1966, that you almost certainly didn't know. Number 1. Kirk was almost never the captain. Let's start with the man who almost wasn't there at all. When Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek to NBC, he didn't have William Shatner in mind. The network was already sold on Jeffrey Hunter, the Hollywood star who had played Jesus Christ in King of Kings. Hunter filmed the original pilot as Captain Christopher Pike. He was serious, brooding, and philosophical. Everything Roddenberry wanted. Then he walked away. Some say his wife advised against television. Others say he felt the project was beneath him. Whatever the reason, he was gone. Enter William Shatner. Bolder, more theatrical, magnetic. The entire soul of the show changed the moment he stepped onto that bridge. Tragically, Hunter died just 3 years later, aged 42, never knowing what Star Trek became. So if Captain Kirk almost didn't exist, then what about the character who defined Star Trek even more than Kirk ever could? Number 2. Spock was supposed to have red skin. The Spock we know almost looked very, very different. Roddenberry's original concept notes described Spock with reddish, almost satanic-looking skin, unsettling, otherworldly, a creature from another world. Early design sketches leaned hard into this demonic visual. Then reality intervened. Black and white television. In 1966, most American households still watched in black and white. Red skin would show up dark, almost black, sending completely the wrong visual message. So they shifted to a greenish-yellow tint, subtle enough to suggest alienness, but light enough to read on monochrome screens. The irony? When the show aired in color, the tint was so subtle, most viewers didn't notice it at all. But the pointy ears carried the weight, and the rest, as they say, is history. But changing Spock's appearance was just the beginning. Because one of the show's most iconic inventions wasn't planned at all. It was a last-minute fix to a much bigger problem. Number 3. The transporter was invented to save money. Ask any Star Trek fan what their favorite piece of technology from the show is, and there's a good chance they'll say the transporter. The ability to disassemble a human being at the molecular level and reassemble them somewhere else, it's one of the most audacious ideas in science fiction. But here's the secret Gene Roddenberry would probably prefer you didn't know. The transporter wasn't born from visionary storytelling. It was born from a budget crisis. The original plan was to show the crew of the Enterprise traveling to planets the old-fashioned way, via shuttlecraft. Land the ship, show the descent, show the approach. It would have looked spectacular. It also would have cost a spectacular amount of money that the show simply did not have. The production team needed a cheaper alternative, and fast. The solution they came up with was the transporter, a special effect created by filming sparkling dust dropped in front of a dark background and then reversing the footage. Total cost: a fraction of what filming a shuttle landing would have required. What started as a cost-cutting measure became one of the defining icons of the entire franchise. Today, physicists debate whether teleportation could ever be real. Scientists at universities run experiments inspired by the concept. All of it traces back to a production team that couldn't afford to build a shuttle. And if something as legendary as the transporter came from a budget crisis, wait until you hear what the network thought of the entire show at the start. Number 4. NBC rejected the original pilot as too cerebral. Most shows get one chance with a network. Star Trek got something almost unheard of. A second chance, but only after being told its first pilot was fundamentally wrong. The original pilot, The Cage, was submitted to NBC in 1965. The verdict was brutal, too cerebral, too slow, not enough action. The female first officer, played by Maggie Barrett, was apparently too much for executives of the era to accept. NBC rejected it outright, but they commissioned a second pilot, almost unprecedented. Roddenberry went back to the drawing board. Out went number 1. In came Kirk, Spock, and a livelier, action-forward tone. But Roddenberry didn't waste the cage. He later repackaged its footage into a 2-part episode called The Menagerie, the only Star Trek episode to win a Hugo Award. The rejected pilot became award-winning television. But even after nearly being rejected, Star Trek pushed boundaries in ways no one expected. And one actress almost walked away before realizing just how important her role really was. Number 5. Nichelle Nichols was convinced to stay by Martin Luther King Jr. In 1960s American television, Nichelle Nichols was doing something radical just by showing up to work. As Lieutenant Uhura, she was one of the first black women in a major, non-subservient role on mainstream TV. She had authority. She was essential. But after the first season, she was ready to quit. Broadway was calling. She submitted her resignation to Roddenberry. Then she attended an NAACP event, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked to meet her. King told her Uhura was a symbol, that for the first time, young black children could see someone who looked like them as a professional, an officer, a person of dignity at the highest levels of human achievement. She withdrew her resignation the next day. She later called that conversation one of the most defining moments of her life. Number 6. Leonard Nimoy was deeply uncertain about playing Spock. Today, Nimoy and Spock are synonymous, but in the early days of production, Nimoy wasn't sure the character would work, or whether he even wanted to play it. His concern was the ears, the pointed ears, the greenish skin, the alien features. He worried it would make Spock look like a monster, a freakish villain, rather than a sympathetic hero. He feared being typecast, reduced to a novelty act in a rubber costume. He also struggled with the emotional flatness the role demanded. Nimoy was a trained, expressive actor. Playing a being who suppressed all emotion required him to completely rewire his instincts. What changed everything was the audience. Viewers didn't see a monster. They saw beneath the stoicism, warmth beneath the logic. Nimoy later wrote 2 autobiographies. The first, I Am Not Spock. The second, I Am Spock. The journey between those 2 titles tells you everything. Number 7. The interracial kiss almost didn't make it to air. On November 22, 1968, Kirk and Uhura shared a kiss, widely cited as one of the first interracial kisses ever broadcast on American primetime television. What you might not know is how hard the network fought to prevent it. NBC demanded the scene be rewritten, so the kiss was forced, compelled by telekinetic aliens, not chosen by the characters. The idea was to give Southern affiliates a way to dismiss it. It wasn't a real kiss. It was alien mind control. But Shatner and Nichols had other ideas. They deliberately flubbed the takes where they kept their heads apart, forcing the director to use the take where they turned toward each other. The network got its disclaimer. The actors got their moment. Nichols later recalled a letter from a white Southerner who said that moment had made him question everything he believed. One kiss, on a science fiction show, changed a man's life. Number 8. The show was saved twice by fan campaigns. Star Trek was never a massive ratings hit. After the first season, NBC began making noise about cancellation. After the second, the noise got louder. What happened next had no real precedent in television history. Fans organized. Estimates suggest over 1 million pieces of correspondence flooded NBC's offices across the 2 campaigns. Petitions circulated on college campuses. Fans marched outside NBC's headquarters. For a fan base with no internet, no social media, and no digital infrastructure, it was an extraordinary act of collective will. It worked twice. NBC renewed the show for a 3rd season, even making a public announcement at a convention. One of the first times in history that audience pressure had visibly reversed a network's cancellation decision. The 3rd season was the weakest, underfunded, buried in a late-night Friday time slot. The show was finally canceled in 1969. But that third season gave it the episode count it needed to enter syndication. And that changed everything. Number 9. The Enterprise model was never finished on the underside. The USS Enterprise, NCC 1701, one of the most recognized spacecraft in all of fiction. But the original filming model had a secret the cameras were never supposed to reveal. The 11-foot model was meticulously detailed, but only on the sides that faced the camera. The visible hull, the nacelles, the saucer section, carefully crafted and painted. The underside, left largely unfinished, bare, rough, unpainted in sections. The reasoning was simple. Every shot was composed from above or the side. There was no budget or reason to finish surfaces the audience would never see. The original model now sits in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. If you ever managed to look underneath, you'd be staring at the unfinished underside of one of the most famous vehicles in the history of storytelling. Number 10. Beam me up, Scotty, was never actually said. This one is almost painful because it feels like it has to be wrong. Beam me up, Scotty is one of the most quoted phrases in pop culture. It's been on t-shirts, bumper stickers, and greeting cards for 50 years. It was even uttered by astronauts aboard the International Space Station when James Doohan, the actor who played Scotty, passed away. And yet, the exact phrase, "Beam me up, Scotty," does not appear anywhere in the original series. Not once. What Kirk actually says, in various episodes, is things like, "Beam us up, Scotty. Scotty, beam me up," or simply, "Enterprise, beam me up." Close variations, endlessly. But the precise combination of words that became the cultural touchstone, never spoken. This phenomenon, where the cultural memory of a quote diverges from what was actually said, is surprisingly common. "Play it again, Sam," was never said in Casablanca. "Elementary, my dear Watson," never appeared in Conan Doyle's original stories. "Luke, I am your father," isn't quite right either. Darth Vader actually says, "No, I am your father." But the Star Trek case is particularly striking because the misquote became more famous than any actual quote from the show. Language takes on a life of its own, and sometimes the story we tell about something matters more than the thing itself. And once you realize how much of Star Trek exists in our imagination, wait until you see how much of what you saw on screen wasn't original at all. Number 11. Most alien costumes were recycled from other shows. Star Trek was set in a universe teeming with alien civilizations. Week after week, the Enterprise crew encountered beings from strange worlds, creatures with exotic fashions, unusual armor, and bizarre ceremonial dress. The wardrobe department must have been extraordinarily creative. They were, but they were also extraordinarily resourceful, because much of what appeared on screen as alien clothing was actually human clothing borrowed, stolen, or repurposed from the studio's existing costume archives. Hollywood studios in the 1960s maintained enormous costume warehouses, the accumulated wardrobe of decades of film and television production. Star Trek's costume team raided these archives constantly. Roman togas became alien ceremonial robes. Western saloon costumes became the attire of distant civilizations. Old science fiction B-movie suits got new paint jobs and alien insignia. Eagle-eyed viewers occasionally spotted familiar pieces. A costume that had appeared in a biblical epic showing up on a distant alien world, or a medieval knight's outfit repainted and re-accessorized into something interstellar. The costume team had a gift for transformation, taking the mundane and making it feel strange. It was creative problem-solving under pressure. And it worked, because on television, where you're watching in someone's living room rather than a cinema, the illusion only has to hold for a few seconds at a time. Because when it came to creating an entire universe on a tight budget, even the show's most iconic weapons had surprisingly humble beginnings. Number 12. The phasers were repurposed toy ray guns. The phaser, the standard-issue sidearm of Starfleet, capable of stun, heat, or full disintegration. It became one of the most iconic prop weapons in all of science fiction. It was also, at least in its origins, essentially a toy. The prop department's starting point for the hand phaser was a collection of plastic ray gun props already sitting in the studio's inventory, novelty items and low-budget props from previous productions. The design team modified them. New paint, new details, new components, grafted on to make them look more sophisticated and futuristic. The result had a slightly toy-like quality that fans noticed even at the time. The plastic looked cheap under close inspection, and the proportions were slightly off for a serious weapon. But on camera, with the right lighting and the right sound effect, they looked like the future. The irony is that the phaser went on to inspire actual weapons research. The US military has spent millions of dollars over the decades on directed energy weapons, laser-based systems that are direct conceptual descendants of what Star Trek imagined. A repainted toy gun became the blueprint for a real weapons program. But those budget solutions didn't always go smoothly. Sometimes they created problems the cast had to deal with in real time. Number 13. The Tribbles were an electrical hazard. No episode of Star Trek better captures the show's playful, creative spirit than The Trouble with Tribbles, the 1967 episode in which the Enterprise is overrun by small, purring, rapidly reproducing, fuzzy creatures called Tribbles. It's funny, clever, and endlessly quotable. What the episode doesn't mention is that the Tribbles were a minor catastrophe behind the scenes. The Tribble props were simple constructions, synthetic fur stretched over foam spheres, with small motors inside some of them to simulate the purring vibration. They looked adorable. Under the hot studio lighting of a 1960s television set, however, they became something else entirely: static electricity generators. The synthetic fur, heated by the studio lights, built up enormous static charges. Tribbles stuck to actors' costumes. They clung to set furniture. They attached themselves to camera equipment. Crew members kept getting small shocks. The more you handled them, the worse the problem got, and the episode required handling hundreds of them. The production team had to develop methods for discharging the props between takes and limiting how long they were exposed to the lights before filming, all so that an episode about cute fictional animals could be completed without electrocuting the cast. Filmmaking is glamorous, and while Tribbles caused chaos behind the scenes, the show accidentally created something that would become a permanent part of pop culture language. Number 14. The red shirt trope was born here. If you've spent any time in geek culture, you know what a red shirt is. It's the disposable character, the anonymous crew member who beams down to the planet with the main heroes and is dead within 5 minutes. The sacrifice that demonstrates danger without risking anyone the audience cares about. Star Trek didn't invent the concept of the expendable supporting character, but it gave the trope its name and its visual language. In the show's color-coded uniform system, red uniforms were worn by the engineering and security departments, the crew members most likely to be sent into dangerous situations. And those crew members, when they appeared as minor characters on away missions, did have a statistically alarming tendency to die. Statistics compiled by fans over the years suggest that red-shirted characters made up a disproportionate share of on-screen deaths. The show never drew explicit attention to this pattern. No character ever says, "Don't wear the red shirt." It was a visual grammar that the audience absorbed unconsciously, episode by episode, until it became a cultural shorthand that outlasted the show by decades. Today, red shirt is used in storytelling discussions, corporate culture, military analysis, and even academic papers on narrative structure. Not bad for a costume choice on a low-budget 1960s sci-fi show, but here's where things get even more surprising, because one of the most famous elements of Star Trek history wasn't actually as central as people think. Number 15. The Klingons were not the main villains. Ask someone who the main villains of Star Trek are, and almost everyone will say the Klingons. The warrior race. The honorable enemies. The rivals who eventually became allies. The Klingons are so deeply associated with Star Trek that it's hard to imagine the franchise without them. But in the original series, the Klingons were actually secondary. The Romulans appeared first, in the episode Balance of Terror, widely considered one of the best episodes of the entire series, and were initially positioned as the primary antagonists. Secretive, calculating, and honor-bound in their own way, the Romulans felt more like a mirror of Cold War-era America's relationship with the Soviet Union. The Klingons appeared in later episodes as a more muscle-bound, straightforwardly aggressive threat, analogous, many critics noted, to a different kind of Cold War anxiety. They were memorable and popular, but they didn't dominate the original series the way later installments would lead you to expect. It was the subsequent films and series, particularly Star Trek III and The Next Generation, that elevated the Klingons to their current cultural dominance. The original show was more nuanced in its villainous landscape than its reputation suggests. And if the villains weren't what you expected, then neither was the way the show built its hero. Number 16. Kirk's heroism was deliberately built around overriding the computer. Captain Kirk has a reputation as a man who trusts his gut, who makes the impossible call, who beats the unbeatable odds. It's the core of his character, and it turns out it wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The writers and producers made a deliberate, documented decision to use the ship's computer as a foil for Kirk's heroism. When the computer spoke, it spoke in probabilities. There is a 78.3% chance of mission failure. The logical course of action results in unacceptable casualties. There is no precedent for a successful outcome. And then Kirk would override it. Every time. And he would be right. This was a very specific argument the show was making about intuition versus data, about human judgment versus machine calculation, about the irreducible value of experience and moral courage in a universe that couldn't be fully quantified. In 1966, as computers were just beginning to enter public consciousness, it was a pointed statement. The debate the show was staging, man versus machine, instinct versus algorithm, is more relevant today than it was when the episodes first aired. Every time we argue about whether artificial intelligence should be trusted to make important decisions, we're having the same argument Kirk had with his ship's computer. He usually won. We're still figuring it out. Because beneath all the space battles and alien encounters, Star Trek was quietly doing something far more daring. Number 17. The show smuggled social commentary past network censors. Gene Roddenberry had a vision for Star Trek that went beyond entertainment. He wanted to use the future as a mirror, to hold it up to the present and say, look at what we are. Look at what we could be. Look at what we're still doing wrong. In the racially charged, politically volatile America of the late 1960s, that was a dangerous ambition. Network censors were vigilant. Anything that seemed to directly address civil rights, Vietnam, the Cold War, or social inequality risked being cut, or killing the show entirely. So Roddenberry and his writers dressed their arguments in alien skin. The episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, features a humanoid alien race divided against itself. One side of their faces black, the other side white. They have spent centuries in mutual hatred and genocidal war over which configuration is superior. The allegory was not subtle. Other episodes addressed war profiteering, political corruption, mob rule, and religious extremism, all through the safe distance of alien worlds and future centuries. The censors, apparently, found it harder to object to metaphors. It was television as political theater, disguised as space adventure. And it worked, not just in getting past the censors, but in reaching audiences who might have changed the channel if confronted with the same ideas without the science fiction wrapper. But not everything on set was serious or political. Sometimes it got downright strange. Number 18. The cast recorded a goofy Christmas album. Not everything happening behind the scenes of Star Trek was high drama or sci-fi genius. Some of it, pure, delightful chaos. At some point during production, someone had the brilliant or slightly unhinged idea to get the cast into a studio and record a full-on Christmas album. And not in a polished, chart-topping way. Oh no, this was camp turned all the way up. William Shatner didn't just sing, he committed. His version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star came out like a dramatic space lullaby, equal parts soothing and slightly confusing. Meanwhile, Leonard Nimoy leaned into his signature seriousness with a spoken-word piece called Once Upon a Star, delivering it like he was narrating the universe itself. Then, you had Nichelle Nichols, Walter Koenig, and the rest of the crew jumping into festive tracks like Christmas Tree with a level of cheer that felt aggressively merry. The wildest part? This wasn't even meant to be a big release. It was basically a quirky little promotional project for fans and studio archives. Then it vanished. For years. Until, of course, it didn't. Bootlegs started circulating, official releases followed, and suddenly, this weird little side project became a cult holiday gem. Because honestly, nothing says Christmas like your favorite space crew being just a little bit ridiculous. Number 19. The budget was shockingly, almost comically low. Everything you've heard in this video, the special effects, the alien makeup, the elaborate sets, the model spacecraft, was produced on a budget that would make a modern YouTube channel blush. The production costs per episode fluctuated, but they were consistently constrained to a degree that required the entire crew to be endlessly ingenious. Sets were reused constantly. The same generic corridor appeared on alien planets, space stations, and Starfleet facilities with minor modifications. Extras were often crew members pulled from other departments and put in costume. Special effects that cost millions today, space battles, planet surfaces, alien environments, were achieved with handcrafted models, painted backdrops, and photographic overlays done in post-production for almost nothing. The show's visual language was built entirely out of creative workarounds. By the third season, the budget had been cut further, and the quality of the effects and the production values declined noticeably. Episodes that should have been visually spectacular were stripped down to talking heads in rooms. The ambition of the scripts outpaced what the money could realize. And yet, stripped of everything except the ideas and the performances, it still worked. Which tells you something important about what actually made Star Trek great. Which makes what happened next even more unbelievable. Because despite all those struggles, the real success story hadn't even begun yet. Number 20. The show became a phenomenon only after it was canceled. Here is perhaps the most important weird fact of all. During its original network run, Star Trek was not a hit. The ratings were mediocre. The network was perpetually unconvinced. The show was canceled after 3 seasons with unspectacular viewership numbers and a time-slot graveyard. By any conventional measure of 1960s television success, it had failed. Then, in 1969 and into the 1970s, the show entered syndication. Local stations across America began airing reruns. College students discovered it. A generation that had been too young to watch it first time around found it in afternoon rerun slots and fell completely in love. The fan conventions began. The original cast began to understand what they had made. The letters multiplied. The merchandise appeared. The cultural weight accumulated slowly, and then all at once, until Star Trek was undeniable, a phenomenon that had grown, paradoxically, from the grave of its own cancellation. The first feature film came in 1979. More films followed. The Next Generation launched in 1987 and became a massive hit. Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, Discovery, Strange New Worlds. A franchise that was canceled as a failure has now been running in some form for nearly 60 years. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary second acts in the history of entertainment. And it happened because the ideas were strong enough, and the fan base was devoted enough to keep it alive through the silence, through the cancellation, through every moment when the universe seemed to be saying it was over, and when a canceled show becomes a global phenomenon. You have to ask, was Star Trek just ahead of its time, or did it actually change the future forever? 20 facts. 20 windows into a show that looked like a low-budget space adventure and turned out to be something else entirely. A vision of the future, built out of limited resources, radical ideas, and a cast of people who genuinely believed they were making something that mattered. They were right. Star Trek did not just predict the future, it helped create it. The flip phone was inspired by the communicator. The tablet computer echoes the PADD, automatic sliding doors, in-ear wireless communication, the medical scanner, all of it seeded into the imagination of engineers and scientists who grew up watching the show in their living rooms. Gene Roddenberry's original mission statement for the show described it as "Wagon Train to the Stars, a frontier adventure in space." What it became was something far more enduring, a set of values encoded in story form, transmitted across generations. The idea that diversity is strength, that curiosity is courage, that the future is worth reaching for, live long, and prosper. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know what to do. Drop a like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us which of these facts shocked you the most. We'll see you in the next one.